So just to preface this evening's show, I've had a neighbor's dog barking quite a bit in the background. I don't know how much of that might end up making its way through the recording, so I'm going to apologize up front. We have an interesting topic this week, though, and I don't exactly know how we're going to tackle it. So I'm going to do my best to intro it as a thought that was sparked from a previous conversation we had, talking about the differences between, opinions and qualified opinions and some of the nuances there. And it made me think it would be interesting to take it a step further and talk about the varying levels of different things that people accept as fact. Things from belief in something or faith in something or an opinion about something, all the way to actually empirically proven factual information, and how those lines get blurred. That's probably about the best intro I can think of. It's exacerbated a lot by other things that are not necessarily problematic, but present in our society that weren't present previously. Obviously, the big one being social media and the easy and instantaneous access to information from all over the place. And a lot of that quote-unquote information is simply opinion or misinformation. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's important to recognize that there's misinformation, which is a whole other category of thing. And there's misinformation that is malicious, and then there's misinformation from ignorance. But they're both misinformation.
I think I would actually include an additional category there. Ignorance. Well, maliciousness and ignorance both obviously are fairly clear-cut, but there's also misinformation rooted in a belief in something, which is not necessarily the same as ignorance. You can make an argument kind of on both sides of that, but I feel like there's a transitionary line in between the two that is difficult to pinpoint. It's a massive gray area, if you will. Because ignorance implies a lack of even attempting to investigate, whereas repeating information based on a belief that it is true implies at least some level of attempting to verify it, however misguided that might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I kind of see that as two forms of ignorance.
Yeah, you can put them in the same overall category. I just feel like there's two underlying principles or approaches to it, and so I want to just mention that I feel like there is a broad spectrum there that should at least be acknowledged.
Yeah, I feel like there's ignorance tends to carry a negative connotation, and there's maybe a stupid ignorance and perhaps a you don't know what you don't know ignorance.
Which would technically be the definition of ignorance anyway. So
Right.
It's why I
Right.
agree that it's the same overall category. It's a nuanced topic.
I think so, because how ignorance is used in the lexicon has somewhat of a jaded or carries a negative connotation. So, yeah.
And since we do tend to want to understand the motivations behind it, because not that it changes the factual basis of the information, but it changes the intent behind the spreading of the information. It's one thing to discuss information being wrong. It's another thing to discuss wrong information being presented with an intent to mislead.
Right.
I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of little sidebars about clarifying nuance with this particular topic.
I think so too, but we should get right in. And
so the way I put it in the notes is that there are, broadly speaking, kind of four or five. I have five general categories of things that are stated in a way that is presented as being known or factual. And I started with the extreme not provable side of things, which would be faith. Faith would be something that is a belief in something absent proof of its existence. And I put belief as the next section or the next item, being that it's the perception that an opinion or interpretation is true and infallible. And I added the definition, it's a state or habit of mind in which trust or confidence is placed in something or someone. So the differentiating factor between faith and belief, faith would be, I don't need to prove it, I trust that it is true. Belief is a perception that something is true based on confidence in the source of that truth. And those are fairly nuanced differentiators as well. And then real quick, I'm just run through the other three, and then got into opinion, being something that's similar to belief, but it at least has its roots in a level of reasoning behind it or rationale behind it. Qualified opinion, we've talked about before, being I have this viewpoint that I have supported based on experience and educated guesses and things that lend more credence to my ability to form an opinion on the subject matter because of my knowledge of the subject in general. And then fact, obviously, being something that is able to be empirically proven and reproduced in some fashion.
So I feel like we need to talk about the nuance of fact and empirically proven.
Probably so.
As a basis for where to go with this conversation.
And I would agree, because factual information doesn't necessarily mean correct, whereas empirically proven information would be correct within our frame of understanding as well.
Right, which could all be presuppose on something that is theoretical and maybe unprovable.
Right.
So I remember in my early 20s being challenged with the question of what is truth. And I remember hearing so many different answers, and I remember a number of people around me, a number of people being polled. I was in a group in this point where this question was asked. It was in a room of several hundred people, and nobody answered the way the questioner was expecting them to, or was satisfactory to the question asker. And I thought that was really interesting, and it really had a huge effect on me. But the answer that was the questioner was asking or was looking for was, truth is that which corresponds to reality. And I found that incredibly insightful, because you can have multiple perspectives of the truth and try to gain the whole truth, but you may or may not be able to. But truth is reality, that which corresponds to reality. It can be, our perceptions, our viewpoints, our biases will all affect that what truth is.
I follow. I think the differing the nuance in the concept of truth is that you're not speaking about truth being completely equatable with 100% factual, non-objective information, right? What I mean by that
Yeah, please.
An individual truth would be rooted in an individual's reality as well, which would be different from person to person because our reality encompasses what we experience.
Like, our reality is a perception, whereas actual reality is that which is, and is like our reality is based on a greater reality or an actual reality. I feel like if we were going to write this down, we would say our reality with a little r and actual reality with the big R.
I follow. I challenge it slightly, and here's why. And it's almost a semantic argument. Truth doesn't necessarily imply a complete and accurate representation of an event for everyone.
Right.
Truth, for all intents and purposes, conveys a complete and accurate representation per individual of an event. And what you're looking for is the representation of the factual event outside of those individual truths.
So it sort of got me thinking.
And just to emphasize, the only thing I'm kind of harping on is that truth in and of itself, the word truth, the idea of truth, doesn't imply accuracy at any level.
Yeah. So the reality is what is.
Right.
Yeah, truth is based on that or corresponds with that. It may not be a full representation, but the truth that you're talking to corresponds with what is. And what we don't have individual realities, we have individual perceptions. And they are based on a reality which and those perceptions may or may not be skewed from what actually is.
Right. That's a good way of understanding what I'm picking at without having a good word to reflect it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I've gotten accustomed to thinking about a particular thing, and if it's brand new, I can the challenge. I understand the challenge, and so it's just like let's work from here to there, and I feel like that accomplishes what I wanted to.
So in the broader scope of the conversation, it's basically the thought of a spectrum of different things ranging from something that is not rooted in or reflected of reality to something that is completely representative of reality and how you distinguish between the different stages. Is that a good way to frame it?
I think so. An example I might give is one that I was actually working on It was based on a conversation I had today with my children, because we were talking about color. One of my children said that their friend was colorblind, and I started talking about colorblindness and what that meant, and I thought about a former work colleague of ours that was also colorblind, and I was talking to them about his experience, and I believe he had trouble distinguishing red and green, and so stoplights it was like the one on top means stop and the one on bottom means go, which is different than that's contrary. We always talk about green means go and red means stop. So I may have that wrong, but I vaguely recall that being the case for. I don't know if you remember or not.
I do, and it's a good way to frame the idea that in both cases, the reality is that one light means stop and one light means go, but the perception of that experience changes from individual to individual and is still true.
Yes.
It's just not equatable from a conversational standpoint of how you describe and talk about those things. You have to find some commonality that is consistent to be able to extrapolate what the reality of that light's composition is.
Right, because you may not remember that red is on top, and you may not, So then you start talking about what visible light is, and then you start talking about wavelengths, because there's visible light is only a thing to our species, or we only talk about it in relative to our species, because there's a physical, or there's a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can perceive, and that spectrum is much larger than our ability to perceive. And there's various colors that we say, or there's various wavelengths that we assign colors to generally, and so it is, I don't want to say it's made up, but we've constructed a way of thinking about it that doesn't encompass what is the whole of the electromagnetic spectrum. So then you start using instruments to talk about infrared and ultraviolet wavelengths and so forth, and microwaves and radio waves. And so it becomes we have a much broader understanding of a small piece of information that we have.
Which actually feeds well into this first point that I feel like we're going to have a broader debate on. So we understand this larger spectrum of things because of the ability to understand a subset of what that spectrum encompasses, right? We've measured it. We are able to recreate results from measurement, and they're consistent across the spectrum of how we measure and how we understand and relate to it, and we treat that as factual information because it's able to be measured and those measurements reproduced over and over and over and over, time and again, right?
Right. So then you get into, is it like, do you believe it or do you accept it to be true?
Well, and I'd like to add a further point to that is, do you accept it to be true based on an understanding of that sub-portion, or do you accept it to be true because you can understand the explanation for the entire range based on the sub-portion? It's slightly nuanced, but it is because this component is understandable and this component is something that is reproducible, and we've extrapolated it to a larger sample. Does that make the larger sample factual, or is it factual because we understand and can wrap our heads around this subset of the larger sample?
Right. So,
and the whole reason I phrase it that way, because it's not a perfect question when you're talking about something that's measurable and repeatedly measurable, but it frames the thought process for how do we accept things as factual.
Right. So we, on one end of that spectrum of understanding is that nothing can be known. And I understand that concept. It's probably a true concept, but
I'm going to remember that when
we have to
toss it back out
right.
at you.
But we have to step away from that, because if nothing can be known,
well, I know where I know where you're going with it.
Yeah.
Here's the piece to remember. Nothing can necessarily be known in complete and utter detail for every scenario, because we don't know every scenario. We can't necessarily know things that we understand today within the framework of what we understand in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years. We advance our understanding of things continuously.
Yeah. So I'm reminded of I believe it was an XKCD comic that I saw at this point almost a decade ago. And I really loved the concept, and I liked it so much that I thought it should be a video, and so I turned it into a video, and I can share that video, and it can go somewhere. I set some music to it that's copyrighted, but somehow Facebook said it was okay, so I don't know. So there are copyright detectors in 2014. I think it was 2014. Yeah, it was early 2014. They're like, didn't say that it was bad, so yeah, whatever. Anyway, in this comic, and sadly, I did not attribute. I made some modifications to it, but I didn't, attribute the source material. So I don't actually know what the source material is. I'll see if I can't find it. But it started out with a single dot, and that dot was the evidence. And when you see the evidence, then you can perform experiments. And when you perform experiments, you get more evidence. So you get more dots. And then, so this one dot is in a black background, and then you see, after you've done experiments, you see two more dots. And they're arranged in such a way that you have, if you were to connect those dots, you'd end up with an isosceles triangle. So you connect the dots and propose a theory. So you have an isosceles, you have this triangle. And then you come up with competing theories. And from those dots, you could have a quadrilateral where maybe one of those dots is missing. You could have a pentagon where two dots are missing. You could have a star where two dots are missing, and an upside down Y, one that you could think that fits inside of a isosceles triangle. So it has all the dots. So you can have many theories, and as you gather even more evidence, in that case, two more dots appear and they're kind of in the shape of a pentagon. If you were to connect them, you can get rid of demonstrably incorrect theories. So in this case, like the quadrilaterals, the Y, the isosceles triangle, they went away. And the only thing that is left is this pentagon and a star. Well, then you can talk about how theories make assumptions. And so the star is more complex and it makes too many assumptions. Not that it's wrong, but theories that make fewer assumptions are more likely to be true. So then you have a more accurate picture of what's going on, and you can compare the theory with what is true, and that's sort of the systematic enterprise we call science that builds and organizes knowledge and form them into testable predictions and about the universe.
And I think it's important to note too in that description that as we understand and test things change. Our understanding of things change. We go from, I think it could be these 12 things that explain it, to there are these 3 things that could explain it. And of these, this one seems the most likely because it makes fewer assumptions.
Right. And then you could be, perhaps studying a virus, and the virus itself is changing. So it's not standing still. So, the theories from one point in time were accurate based at that time, but can change because the thing that it is that you're studying has also changed. So it's a classic, in a particular, it's a moving the goalpost kind of situation, but that is the nature of the world we live in, or the universe we live in, or the cosmos we live in, and whatever's larger than the cosmos.
Well, it's a good way to remind that even though we talk about these different classifications of types of information, even those classifications move. You know, what we believe can morph into something that is at least rooted in some sort of logical chain of events that becomes opinion. And that opinion could move to something that is studied and understood better and become qualified. And then maybe you even take it a step further and you're able to prove that opinion in some fashion, and it moves into the realm of more than an opinion, but not fact yet, because it takes more than a single person coming up with an idea and testing it. You know, it has to be reviewed and reproduced under objective conditions and everything else before it can move into the realm of factual information. Or that's not necessarily accurate. Before it can move into the realm of empirically tested and proven information that then becomes factual. But it's a reminder that all of these different things are fluid. And all of these things are also rooted in what someone chooses to investigate further because of an idea or a belief or
interest.
Exactly. Like, none of these things are inherently bad, and none of these things are inherently problematic. It's how we learn more about the world around us and ourselves and everything else. The problematic aspect is not being able to identify what type of information you are being presented. We live we live in a world now where all of these different types of information are presented as statements of fact. And unfortunately, we also live in a world where too many people don't have a willingness or desire to understand the difference between those types of information that are presented.
Yes. I can remember a saying of the day calendar I had when I was a teenager, and this has stuck with me since then, and it is that it's so much easier to jump to conclusions than it is to dig for facts.
You know, I've heard that phrase a number of times, and every time, without fail, I think about the jump to conclusions Matt from Office Space.
Yeah, I do too. I'm pretty sure that I had read this as a teenager. Well, I know I read it prior to that movie being released, but it wasn't long after that the movie was released, and I do think of the jump to conclusions Matt as well.
Random sidebar, but I had to put that in. A good Office Space reference can't go unmentioned.
No, absolutely not. And I could talk about that for a bit, but that's a different thing. So it kind of one of the things that I have wondered about and through the years is like, what is the virtue of faith?
Yeah, I was going to try to come up with a good way to segue back to that, but I think you did it well. So let's focus in on the nuances of understanding information, because I think it's best illustrated through this concept of what it means to have faith in something. And I want to start with pulling back from what I just described to the sub-item that you included, because I think it helps illustrate what I am trying to point to in a way that I don't know if I have a different framework for being able to talk about it. And so the note that you put in was that Christianity, how exactly did you phrase it? It was Christianity is a form of agnosticism.
Agnosticism, yeah. Yes.
So,
I mean, it's tricky. You'd have to go with like agnostic as the maybe classical definition of agnostic, and not necessarily how we're using that term, because like sometimes we're using the term agnostic as a a spectrum as a person on a spectrum between atheism and believer, which is not fair.
Yeah, it's completely inaccurate. Well, yeah, I feel it is completely inaccurate.
I agree.
Let me tackle this slightly, and then let's see if it lines up with what you were thinking. So,
yeah,
agnosticism is a understanding of any idea, whether it's religious or not, where there's an acceptance of a certain level of fact and a acceptance of a corresponding fact that you may or may not be able to, and probably will not be able to, completely understand the ramifications of that belief ever. So it's kind of like the idea of believing in a thing. So we'll use Christianity as the example. So believing in God, but understanding that your belief might be flawed and it doesn't change your belief. Is that a fair enough representation of trying to boil it down into a single line concept, or did you have something else in mind there?
So I think that's a very accurate. I think that's an accurate way of rephrasing, or expounding on what I was trying to get at. But I realize in the world today, even if you were to just say in the city that we live in, or the greater metro area that we live in, one's concept of Christianity is vastly different from many others. There's so much.
Yeah, we can do an entire show on that.
You could say that the various beliefs are very fractured, and the various understandings are fractured between denominations and individuals and so forth. So the idea is that if you believe that, if faith is believing in something without proof, that's regardless of what the belief is, that's a form of agnosticism. So I'd say that the atheist is an agnostic and the Christian is an agnostic. But many of the Christians that I know, they would say, I have faith, but then they would also tell me that they know as a matter of fact that their beliefs are true, which tells me, it's like, well, then where does faith come in?
And so
it's a bit ironic.
So much that crosses my mind there, and I don't want to immediately become offensive to anyone who might listen. So let me phrase something first.
Neither do I. I want to be very careful, because like some of the most important people, I am a non-believer, and some of the most important people in my life are believers, and so I want to talk about these things, and I want to I have questions I have for them because I want to understand them, but also sometimes I want them to see beyond the narrative that they were given during their formative years and maybe their entire lives, and just really put it out there. But I also want to do it in a respectful way.
Let me see if this qualifies it in a way, or bad wording. Let me see if this phrases it in a way that makes sense as a point to kind of start from. So I am a believer, and here's the way I phrase it. There are many major religions in the world. All of them share a number of common principles and thoughts and ideas. If you honestly look at faith in a higher power as something that is attempting to ascribe a level of unknowable guidance to the world at large, you can't look at the specifics of a religious teaching and say that it is factual. Because every religion, every major religion, focuses on principles of how to live, not facts about what transpired, even though it is taught in a way that these are the facts of what transpired. Quite frankly, anyone who adheres to any single religious teaching as this is factual and all others are wrong cannot know that, cannot in any way, shape, fashion, or form know that. It's a blind belief in what is being relayed. But if you focus on this idea of loving your neighbors as you love yourself, as an idea of being a better person and trying to make the world around you better, and realizing that those same teachings reoccur throughout the major religions, then you start to get a better picture of what it means to be within the scope of reality of what it means to believe in a higher power. I could absolutely have it wrong. Maybe Islamic beliefs are 100% accurate. Maybe the Jewish are 100% accurate. It doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because the basic principles of doing better and being a better person are equitable across the board. Now, here's the caveat to that. I am the type of person that if it means if I have the slightest doubt in that belief or that faith in trying to be a better person, that I'm condemned for it, fuck it, I'll see you in hell. But that's because I fully accept my place here is to try to be better, to try to do better, and to try to make those around me better for having known me. And if I achieve that, as far as I'm concerned, I'm successful. I don't need a focused set of teachings that I adhere to achieve that purpose.
Right. So we can sort of skip over the, if you don't believe the way that I believe, you're condemned. It's the sort of, it makes me think of this meme that I love of Jesus knocking on somebody's door and it says, "Hey, let me into your heart." And the person inside says, "Well, why?" "Because of what I'm going to do to you if you don't." So like we can skip past that sort of rubbish.
Yeah, there's a lot of crap that I will absolutely give.
Yeah. But there, if you accept that the idea of the multiverse is as a true thing, there is a universe where that is true, and that is reality. And there's a universe for every person's belief and every permutation of that belief for every person that exists in our reality, that has ever existed, that will exist, and every other universe. So it's infinite. And then there's like one universe where there are no multiverses, and that's a paradox that I don't know how to deal with. Pretty sure I've said this on this show, but I'm going to say it again because it's applicable. So I want to go back, skipping over all of that. I come back to the idea of what is the virtue of faith. And I don't want to set any traps. So,
well, there's an easy answer, but I'll let you continue first before I don't want to bias what you're going to phrase.
Yeah. So I've heard someone say, well, faith is, believing in a thing. And I want to distinguish faith is different than reasonable expectation. And, you've heard if you've never sat in a chair before and you go sit down in it, and then you have faith in that the chair will hold you up. And I'm like, no. That's not what faith is. That's just, looking at a chair and determining that it's sturdy is sitting down with the reasonable expectation that it's going to hold you up. Because, it's a judgment call. So faith is different from that. And the question is, what is good about faith?
So the easy answer is that faith gives hope. It's more nuanced than that. Faith.
So hope is a word that came to mind as well. And is hope a different thing than faith?
Faith is the thought and desire that something means more than what we understand it to mean. So we hope that through our life doing these things means more than just doing these things for 20, 50, 70 years, whatever the lifespan is. We hope in a greater meaning beyond the physical time we have that we are aware exists. Faith is a desire to place that meaningfulness on a greater timeline and greater scale than the limited time that we know is physically afforded to us. Who doesn't want their life to mean more than what they were able to accomplish in 10 years, 15 years?
Right. So I've thought about that before, because I know everybody wants to be more, but what if you're not?
Well, that's the interesting part of how I approach faith. I am going to be an outlier, so this is not a good explainer for the way most people approach it.
That's okay, because I think maybe the way most people approach it is...
Yeah, I think most people approach it in a way to attain something. I don't.
I think it's you go ahead, because, well, I was going to say, I feel like I hope this is the harshest thing I say, but I feel like sometimes people use faith as a crutch.
They do. They absolutely do. So for me, faith is a attempt to reconcile my hope that there is something greater and something that is lasting as a result of my influence versus the recognition that it's just as likely that my influence dies with me. I hope that it's greater than that. I want it to be greater than that. But I'm also too rational and logical to not have some level of acceptance that my lifespan is probably the only thing I get ever.
See, I'm sort of in the same place. Like, I was like, I don't matter to anybody except for the people that are around me in the life, and I might affect more. I probably affect more people than I know, but I think about my great grandfather, or how many my great grandfathers and great grandmothers, and I think about my great. Maybe I'll have maybe there will be people that will be my great grandchildren, and none of them matter to me. Like, I'm existing in a space other than my great grandparents don't matter to me, other than their DNA got passed on to create me.
But other than the pure, you have to owe your existence to them, like the basic biological concept of procreation.
Right. Other than that, they're complete strangers. They don't matter to me at all as individuals. They can't matter to me because they're gone. And every other person that would be my, we'd say our descendants, they don't matter to me other than that I exist because they existed and they did a thing at a certain time and so forth. So I can't feel that I matter to anybody else. And so when you say that you hope that you matter more than that, I was like, that feels like it's just hope, and I don't see how faith comes into that. Like, I would hope that maybe there's something beyond, but maybe when you die, it's just like before you were born. I don't remember that, and I don't and I won't remember what's coming after.
Yeah, there's a slight differentiation, which is that the hope in mattering or having an effect isn't rooted in an individual's recognition or recollection of me. It's rooted in the influence that guides those who are immediately known to me. So, like in this case, my son, guiding influence into what he is able to bring forward based on those values and principles instilled in an idea of, I may not be able to understand or acknowledge or feel any ramifications of those in this particular sphere of existence. But I hope that there is something that explains why I have a desire to matter more that I just can't see now. So there's this concept of, I hate to use the term afterlife because I don't necessarily think that applies, but there's this concept of a slightly different reality that maybe exists that we can't know exists until we see it or experience it. And I hope that it exists, and I want to live as though it exists, not for any level of differentiation in that particular existence, but for a desire that by doing so, this existence that I know is better as a result. And that, even saying it, it's really difficult to grasp kind of what I'm focusing on, because you can be a better person without any level of faith.
Yes. I mean, if it kind of feels like you might be talking about like reincarnation, and I wouldn't say that is limited to any particular religion, but
so the way I typically have described this, and this might help phrase it in a better scenario or frame it in a better way to understand my thought process. There's no way I can know what exists that I don't understand. Right? I mean, we can say that of any type of information, be it rooted in scientific investigation or not. I can only understand what I understand, right? So the way I have acknowledged things in general is that there are certain things that I see that are well enough beyond the realm of comprehension that I have, that I believe there is something orchestrating those things that is more capable than humanity. What that is, I ascribe to those things I have been exposed to. And that means that I ascribe certain things to a divine power because that's what I've grown up knowing. That doesn't mean I'm right. I'm by nature a very logical and rational person, and I've explored enough different ideas and concepts to say I choose a belief structure based on what feels comfortable and hopeful for me. But I'm not naive enough to think that it's completely accurate or it's the only belief structure that fits. So this is why I added the comment that I typically agree with agnosticism being a perfect way to describe things, because the way I've described to myself in past conversations is the idea of a Taoist life philosophy with Christian beliefs, because Taoism implies a belief in some greater power, but you can't understand or describe it, and you don't need to. You just accept that it exists. Christianity provides the framework to say, I believe this particular set of beliefs, and I'm going to live according to the appropriate teachings. And we can have a whole separate conversation about that. But the actual real proper teachings that Christianity provides. And if I'm wrong, it's okay.
Yeah. So if you believe that the teachings of Christianity are strictly the red letters, so, the words of Jesus Christ, I think you're probably going to get it right most of the time. But if you go in...
Go ahead.
But if you go beyond that, looking at, I'm most familiar with the Protestant Bible. I'm not at all familiar with the Gnostic gospel, other than that it it's a thing that exists. It wasn't in the Bible that I grew up with. But if you go outside of the teachings of Jesus, like I'm going to say, like the teachings of Jesus, they're not all the best. Most of them are pretty good. Most Christians have twisted it into something that fits a narrative that they've created that is not biblical.
Very
but
much
then if you
agreed.
go, but even if you go beyond that and you look at the rest of the text of the New Testament, there's a lot of problems, and they do not line up with the teachings of Christ. And if you start looking at the Old Testament, then you have a lot of things that really do not line up with the teachings of Christ. And then you get more into like the traditions and the beliefs of the Hebrews. And so, it's really weird to hang on to something that old, because at the time, we live in the 21st century, and at the time they were working on, they created deities to give explanation to lightning and thunder. So we've moved on past that.
And the big thing that I always emphasize when I have this conversation in general, and I want to make sure I phrase it that way because I'm not trying to argue the point at all. The ideas behind the way you live are fairly consistent, whether you're talking about Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Sorry, I butchered that, so I do apologize for any Jewish listener that might happen to find it. Judaism, Buddhism, even like any of the major ideas behind things that could be considered religion. And I phrase that specifically because there are debates about how you classify religious structures versus just philosophical leanings and directions. But if you look overall at the concepts, not the specific teachings, but the concepts presented in those canonical works based on religion, the concepts tend to line up very well, which means at the end of the day, honestly, they're all probably talking about the same thing in different contexts. And if that's the case, it's all about being a better person by trying to do the right thing for those around you. It really is simple enough to boil down into the quote-unquote golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
There's a better rule. There's a platinum rule.
All right.
Do unto others as you know they want done unto them.
Oh, I would argue that.
Well, so the masochist says to the sadist, hurt me. And the sadist says, no.
Yeah, I would still argue that. Because the idea is to do what is right for a person in the expression of loving that person, not what that person wants you to do because that's how they perceive affection.
So I'll give this example. If I'm not feeling well, my girlfriend wants to take care of me. Like, she wants to be there for me. She wants to provide, make sure that I have everything I need. I don't want that. I mean, the most I want to have done for me is get a bunch of Gatorade and put them in my refrigerator so they're cold. But otherwise, I want to be left alone to sleep. And it's like, if she's not well, she wants to be like, let me be there for you. Let me make sure, maybe make sure you got some soup. Let me make sure you have everything you need. You get tucked in. It's like we want the opposite things. So if she follows the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then I'm not in a good place. Like, I'm not getting what I want or need.
So technically I would say both are flawed.
Okay.
But we don't have a general framework that exists that is recognizable on a large scale to be able to try to provide that guiding idea. So the way I would say they're both flawed is that both of them rely on what an individual wants.
Yeah.
What is it that is actually needed? Which could actually be a middle ground between those. But how do you explain that to the masses in general?
I don't know.
Because we try to boil it down to something that is easily digestible.
Something, a pithy quip, you can say.
And the reality is that nothing is that easy. There's compromise in everything we do when it comes to interactions with others. But if you start from a place of trying to do for someone what you would want someone to do for you, then it can evolve into doing what is needed for that person as long as you're willing to listen to feedback. And that's a whole separate thing that we didn't even touch on up to this point that is crucial for understanding interactions, but it's not crucial for understanding the different types of information presented. So that's probably a good teaser for a follow-up.
Yeah, that's the next episode. I don't know that we got into any of what we listed here in this what you listed here in this first episode.
I mean, I think we talked about it, but I had a feeling with what I outlined that we were going to start just at a specific point and flow through it for a few episodes.
Oh yeah, this is going to be a series.
I feel like we do a lot better when we talk about abstract concepts than when we talk about like the Apple event.
Chip design?
Like, have you noticed over the past few episodes when we focus on either social or behavioral issues, it really tends to flow better? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, because like I felt like I was listening to the episode that came out today, and I was like, ugh. And so now I feel like for the next Apple event, it's just like here's my uncompromised list of predictions, and it's probably going to be in the after show.
Yeah, I was thinking about earlier. Maybe we actually really focus in on some of these abstract concepts and make it a consistent thing, and then the after show just be the random one-off topics that we end up wanting to discuss.
Yeah. Because where this is like, I can talk about this because it's more abstract. I was like, I have no business talking about chip design.
Well, and I think it's even more nuanced. I think for both of us, talking about these kinds of things hits more where we want other people to hear thoughts and think about things and inspire that thought process. Like, whether we're right or wrong doesn't matter. But if you take the time to think about it as a result of listening to us talk about it, well, that's absolutely where I want to be.
I feel like the only Apple-related things that are worth talking about is like experiences working for Apple retail. I think that's something that we could talk about reasonably. But if we're going to talk about an Apple event, I mean, who wants to listen to us talk about that unless we really have something special to add? Because you've got folks like Renee Ritchie and John Gruber and John Siracusa that have a track record of providing better insight to those sort of things.
Yes, I'd agree. I was thinking about that earlier today.
Yeah, me too. Oh man, we are on a wavelength here. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.